So this week we are discussing, does effective altruism have a funding gap? And I might be a little bit light on the intro today. I didn't do as much research as I'd like to, but I want to just shape the discussion for the rest of our time. So as a roadmap, I want to just define what EA is and also real briefly what I mean by a funding gap, then look at just a couple of articles that have been written about this within the EA movement and outline some common stances, mention some takeaways from these articles, and then raise some questions that we can address in smaller groups. So effective altruism, it's two things. It's an idea and it's a community focused on using evidence and careful reasoning to figure out the very best ways to improve the world and then to act on that basis. So I'm speaking to you from EA for Christians. We're a group of Christians within this broader global community. And when we're asking this question, does EA have a funding gap? It's really helpful to have a nuanced and distinguished definition of EA. And so when some people mention EA, they refer to a network of organizations within the movement, which range from very well-known ones like the Center of Effective Altruism or GiveWell, ranging from there to lesser known orgs like any given charity startup, especially those from charity entrepreneurship or any other charity startup aligned with this kind of evidence-based principle of doing good. So maybe it's helpful to distinguish between EA more meta and EA more particular in the form of these organizations. A funding gap, by this I just mean some kind of money that's needed to fund ongoing operations that's not currently funded. So there have been a couple of EA articles that have touched on this. And in the past, some people have made comments like EA is no longer funding constrained. To give you some context, there have been a few big donors who've pledged to give quite a lot of money to effective altruism organizations. Some notable examples would be Sam Bankman-Fried from FTX. He runs one of the largest Bitcoin trading firms, and his net worth was evaluated a few months ago at something like $26 billion. And he's pledged to give 99% of that away to effective altruism organizations. So it's understandable that people now are making claims like, oh, EA is no longer funding constrained. Of course, we need to have more nuance when talking about like, what do we mean when we say EA, or what do we mean when we say it's not funding constrained or doesn't have a funding gap? So this is an interesting article. Maybe some of you have read it here on the EA forum, which breaks down different EA causes and also different organizational size based off their need for funding, and also the number of funders within for those types of orgs that have unique views. So for instance, even if you're looking at a cause like global poverty, the author writes that there's a very low chance that there's a funding gap if it has very large scale funding within the EA movement. But the smaller startups in this space have quite a lot of competition. And it, of course, varies by cause. So poverty might have different funding gaps from animal welfare, different funding gaps from artificial intelligence, charities, and so forth. Another article that touches on this theme is an article from Benjamin Todd, who's one of the co-founders of 80,000 Hours, which advises effective career choice. And Benjamin argues that he's kind of arguing against this view that, oh, now that we have billion-dollar funders, that we're no longer funding constrained. And he argues that individual donors can still have a significant impact. And he gives a few examples of how. One of his main points is that what matters is not the total amount of funding, but the current level of cost effectiveness at the margin. And he also makes a few related points. One that I thought was interesting was this idea that even though there are tens of billions of dollars pledged to give to charity within the broader effective altruism community, a lot of these pledges are coming from larger donors who aren't giving that all at once. And so someone like someone like Sam Bankman-Fried from FTX might only donate about 1% of his worth every year. So even if he's worth 30 billion, he might be donating 300 million a year. And if you look at the range of organizations within effective altruism, the budget of those organizations exceeds 300 million by quite a lot. So there's still quite a lot of room. Another point that Ben makes is that smaller donors should be able to match larger donors in terms of cost effectiveness by quote unquote funding with them. And the idea is something like this. If Open Philanthropy, which is a foundation that does a lot of grant making in the EA movement, is going to make a grant to AMF, that then by donating to AMF, what you do is you free up a bit of money for Open Philanthropy to then donate the money instead to AMF to some other organization that is likely just as effective, maybe slightly less effective. And then another point that Ben makes is that sometimes smaller donors can beat larger donors in terms of cost effectiveness by giving in ways that larger donors are ill-equipped or just not nimble enough to give to. So some examples of this would be giving to political campaigns. Some political campaigns in the US are capped at something like $5,000 per donation. Also, a lot of these bigger donors are constrained by their networks and who they know, and also orgs that are just big enough to research. I know GiveWell doesn't fund many orgs with, I don't know if GiveWell actually even evaluates orgs that have operating budgets under a couple $1 million. So if you're an effective, if you're like an effective health and development org and you're operating on a very small scale, then your lifeline is from smaller donors. And there's no way that OpenPhil or Sam Bankman-Fried is going to give them a lifeline. So smaller donors can fit in the bill there. And in that sense, it's not funding constrained. But then there have been some criticisms against some of these points that Ben Todd has made. And I thought some of these criticisms were encapsulated nicely in this article, A Red Team Against the Impact of Small Donations. And some points from this article, I guess one sticks out to me in particular. I didn't read it totally through in all the comments of it, but one point that stuck out to me in flying over it was this idea that maybe funding doesn't make as much sense. This idea that by giving to GiveWell, like giving to AMF, you are freeing up some funds from OpenPhil to give to some other effective charity, because OpenPhil and these bigger givers, they've already done their research on where they'd like to give, and they're actually not constrained by their funding in giving. They're constrained by their research and analysis and finding out effective opportunities. And they've already effectively funded all effective opportunities that they know about. And if they hadn't, then they wouldn't be keeping their money in the banks as they are. So if you're sympathetic to that, then you might think, well, a donation to AMF is actually more like a donation to OpenPhil or any of the number of big funders that would have donated to them had you not donated to them. And so this opens up a lot of interesting ideas where when you start thinking about these counterfactuals, like it's no longer a simple choice of donating to one charity or another, but you're sort of like a piece in a bigger puzzle of how other philanthropists will act. And it just becomes much more complicated, which maybe is closer to reality, but it's less what people expect they're getting into when they get into effective altruism. And maybe interestingly, like the point of GiveWell for many people is to have a very high credibility, reliable way of donating in a way that's impactful on the margin. But if on the margin, we're actually just freeing up funds for some other big donor to use in some other way, like it's much more harder to calculate, and there's much less security in our giving, much less certainty rather. Anyways, these are just some articles that I found very helpful on this topic, but I'm not an expert, and I would love to learn from you guys. I'm curious what your impression is on the question, does EA have a funding gap? Also, can GiveWell charities, which many on this call and many in our community support, charities like Against Malaria Foundation that donate malaria nets, charities like SCI Foundation that donate deworming tablets, can these charities still accomplish an incredible amount of good with additional donations? Or do you see a donation to these charities as something like a donation to Open Phil, which might actually use the money for some other purpose? And then finally, in light of these recent developments, have you shaped your career at all? Because I know a lot of us are thinking about like how can we use our careers to do good? How can we either use our careers to earn money to give away, or maybe even to do good directly? So I'm curious if if the answer to this question, does EA have a funding gap, influence your thoughts about your career?